The year is 1945. World War II has been going on for 6 years at this point. Germany and Italy are no longer part of the equation, Italy having surrendered 2 years earlier, and Germany having surrendered earlier that year. Faced with a massive loss of American lives, President Harry Truman orders the first and only use of atomic weapons in human history. On August 6th, a nuclear bomb is dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another bomb is dropped, this time on Nagasaki. Between the two bombings, it is estimated that over 200,000 people were killed or injured, most of which were civilians. Now, I could write a whole essay about the political implications of this act, and I will say that regardless of whether it was justified or not, it was a tragic loss of human life, and one I hope will never be repeated. But that's not what this video is about. This video is about Godzilla. Hi, I'm Forrest. Welcome to Political Thoughts. Godzilla was released in Japan in 1954, 9 years after the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 2 years later, an American version would be released, with most of the political context stripped out and American actors put in to make it more appealing to American audiences. Now, I'm not really interested in talking about the American version in this video, except to say that it's an abomination, and it gives the Japanese cut a bad name. You see, the Japanese version is a deep and philosophical piece, where the American version is just a silly mess. In fact, this is probably the reason why every time I try to convince my dad that Godzilla is a cinematic masterpiece, he just kind of gives me a blank stare. In fact, a lot of people think that the Godzilla movies are just silly popcorn flicks, and more than 30 of them have been made, and that is definitely true of most of those movies, but especially in the case of the first Godzilla, it is a meaningful look into the effect of nuclear weapons and whether the ends justify the means. I started out this video talking about the nuclear bombs dropped in Japan. Though they are only referenced in passing in the film, Godzilla's plot is driven heavily by their influence. Now, I must warn you, spoilers abound from this point on, so if you don't want the plot of a movie that is more than 70 years old spoiled for you, now would be the time to back out, go watch the movie, and then come back to finish the video. Our movie begins with ships being mysteriously destroyed in the ocean around Odo Island, a fictional Japanese island. It turns out that around the same time, citizens of the island are no longer able to catch fish. After some investigation, it is discovered that there is a giant monster laying waste to the area. A paleontologist named Kyohei Yamane reports that the monster is a giant dinosaur who was disturbed by underwater hydrogen bomb testing. Yamane insists that the monster, called Godzilla after a legend told by the people of Odo Island, should be studied, but the government decides to try to destroy Godzilla. These attempts are unsuccessful, and this is where our obligatory love triangle comes in. Yamane has a daughter named Amiko, who is engaged to one of Yamane's colleagues, Daisuke Serizawa. However, Amiko is in love with a salvage ship captain named Hideto Ogata. She goes to visit Serizawa to break off her engagement, but before she can, he shows her his current work on a powerful superweapon, a device that destroys oxygen atoms and kills anything in range. Amiko is upset by this and leaves without telling him about the engagement thing. Meanwhile, Godzilla is continuing his reign of terror in Japan, and in desperation, Amiko tells Ogata about Serizawa's oxygen destroyer. Ogata confronts Serizawa and begs him to use the oxygen destroyer on Godzilla, but Serizawa is afraid of what the government would do with the technology and initially refuses. Eventually he relents, but not without burning his notes so that the government won't have access to them. Serizawa and Ogata go on a mission together to plant the device, which they do successfully, but Serizawa cuts off his own air support and sacrifices himself so that the government can never use him to learn the secret of the oxygen destroyer. Godzilla is no more, but Yamane fears that if they continue testing nuclear weapons, there may end up being another Godzilla-like event in the future. There are two main ways that Godzilla critiques nuclear weapons and nuclear testing. First, in how Godzilla is created, and second, in the struggle to decide whether to use the oxygen destroyer to deal with Godzilla. Godzilla was minding its own business deep in the ocean for millions of years, and would have stayed there if it weren't for underwater H-bomb testing. In the film, nuclear testing is seen as destructive, not just in the way it can be used to make bombs to intentionally harm people, but as destructive by nature. Japan never drops bombs on anyone, but they are punished with Godzilla for even experimenting with something so destructive. Godzilla is a natural force of chaos, basically a giant lizard who doesn't have malicious intent, but wreaks havoc and destruction wherever it goes, just by the very nature of its size. It is impervious to weapons, including nuclear weapons. Which leads us to Serizawa's oxygen destroyer. Within humanity's grasp is a weapon powerful enough to destroy Godzilla, but the question becomes, do the ends justify the means? Yes, Serizawa's technology is capable of destroying Godzilla, but to do so would put that very technology in the government's hands, the very same government that brought Godzilla upon Japan by developing advanced weapons in the first place. Serizawa refuses to use his device at first for this very reason. He doesn't want a technology he created to be used to cause harm. Eventually, though, seeing the amount of destruction that Godzilla is causing, he realizes that he has no choice in the matter. He must either use the oxygen destroyer, or many people will die. However, he is still firm in his obligation to keep his technology out of the government's hands, so he destroys all his notes and nobly sacrifices himself to ensure that his oxygen destroyer can never be used again. For Serizawa, the end only justifies the means if the means die with the end. I've seen it remarked online that in Japan, radiation creates monsters, and here in America, radiation creates superheroes. This isn't a really great comparison, as Godzilla isn't created by radiation, he's just disturbed by it, and here in America, we have our share of monster movies about monsters that were created by radiation. A good example being the movie Them, which was released the same year that Godzilla was released in Japan, and features giant ants that were mutated by radiation. However, this comparison does give us some insight into the difference between the way Japan views nuclear weapons versus the rest of the world. You see, Japan is in a unique position to talk about these things. To this day, they remain the only country that has had nuclear weapons actually used against them. Sure, other nations such as the US have lived under the threat of nuclear war. Decades were spent competing with Russia to stockpile nuclear weapons, and even now there are concerns about countries like Iran and North Korea developing nuclear weapons. But only Japan has actually experienced the horror of having their own cities obliterated by such weapons. Though Japan does use nuclear technology for non-violent purposes, they have been strictly opposed to the development of all weapons of mass destruction since World War II ended, and they have signed any relevant non-nuclear treaties that have come their way. Japanese media is often strongly anti-nuke, including Hideo Kojima's Metal Gear series, the fifth installment of which had a cutscene that was locked until all players concurrently eliminated their nuclear stockpiles, something that took 5 years to achieve, and so far has only been achieved on one console. It turns out that even 60 years after the release of Godzilla, its core themes are still felt throughout Japan. Godzilla is an important part of cinema history. It stands as a representation of a people who are traumatized by the effects of the development of nuclear weapons. and it deals with the fears of what a nuclear world might look like. Though many people see the Godzilla films as a bunch of popcorn flicks, it's also a deep dive into the political state of Japan, with various films approaching subjects like the government, the media, capitalism, and the effects of war on people. I hope to be able to explore more Godzilla films in the future, but no Godzilla film is more important to me or more relevant than the 1954 original.